1 Samuel.
That's just before 2 Samuel.
Oh, Samuel.
1 Samuel, chapter 17. Let's get back into our history. We're studying the people of Israel, the people of God's promise and the land of God's choosing. Why do we study people from 3,000 years ago?
17.
Oh.
Well, for one thing, we can study these folks without getting sued.
Yes.
You know, if you talk about people today, in today's crazy world, even if you make truthful observations, you're just one lawsuit away from a really nasty time, especially if there are negative things involved. One of the gifts for us to study God's Word is that we can see in peoples of the past, we can see what happened to them. We can learn. We can learn from their example, and we don't get sued. So let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. The history is this. The Israelites were in slavery and bondage in Egypt. And at the time of the Exodus, Moses, under God's instruction, led the people out. They came to the new land where they inhabited it. And we went through this period, this loose confederation, this late Bronze Age, early Iron Age historical setting. It's going to be a little bit important here in this setting today. You know, the South, believe it or not, was a wasteland, relatively speaking, just 2 generations ago. It was very difficult to live here as a permanent resident. It was hard to, it was a non-trivial thing compared to the way it is today. Today we can sustain and support life so much better in this region because of the advent of the power grid and air conditioning. It became much easier for people to live in this region. But if you remember the early years, you remember that there were the haves and there were the have-nots. And maybe some of you were some of the haves at that time, and maybe some of you were some of the have-nots at that time. Maybe you remember what it was like to live in this region before air conditioning and the power grid and reliable refrigeration were as common as they are now. Well, it's the same way here. We're transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Israel was never a leading empire in this period as the world evaluates empires. So when you go and you look at history books of this era, historians don't typically single out this nation as the example. And so during this period, in fact, Israel is a little bit of the backwater. So we're coming out of the Bronze Age collapse that happened somewhere around 1000 BC. It was a collapse of the known world of that point. We had fallen into famine, had fallen into natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, the migrations of peoples, the sea peoples, and other invading forces attacked the empires of that day. Places like Greece, Egypt, Sumeria, the Hittite Empire, for example. And so now these people in Israel sort of coexist with the Israelites. and they're called the Philistines. And at this point, many scholars suspect that the Philistines were one of those ravaging sea peoples from the Bronze Age collapse. Half nomad, half warrior. They had maybe left their life in one place, driven by the disasters, driven by the famine and plagues. Remember Joseph and the plagues of, the famine of those days? These were great times of change and upheaval. And so now these people are living in the land with the Israelites, and they're called Philistines. And we're going to see that one of the things about the Philistines that gave them an edge over the people of Israel is the Philistines were relatively well-to-do in comparison. They were the haves, and the people of Israel were the have-nots at this time. We're going to read a little bit about that. So there's a culture clash going on here, and we've come to perhaps one of the most famous stories in the Scriptures. Let's see what we can learn from this. 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Philistines got ready for war and brought their troops together to attack the town of Succoth in Judah. They set up camp at Ephes Dammim between Succoth and Azekah. King Saul and the Israelite army set up camp on a hill overlooking Elah Valley. And they got ready to fight the Philistine army that was on a hill on the other side of the valley. The Philistine army had a hero named Goliath, who was from the town of Gath, who was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet and bronze armor to protect his chest and legs. The chest armor alone weighed about 125 pounds. He carried a bronze sword strapped on his back, and his spear was so big that the iron spearhead alone weighed more than 15 pounds. A soldier always walked in front of Goliath to carry his shield. Goliath went out and shouted to the army of Israel, "Why are you lining up for battle? I'm the best soldier on our side, and all of you are in Saul's army. Choose your best soldier and come out and fight me. If he can kill me, our people will be your slaves. But if I kill him, your people will be our slaves. Here and now, I challenge Israel's whole army. Choose someone to fight me." Saul and his men heard what Goliath said, but they were so frightened of Goliath that they couldn't do a thing. Now, what's happened here? Saul was described as being head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel. Remember earlier when he was chosen to be the king?
Mm-hmm.
He was described as that champion type specimen of a man. And yet here now, he's cowering down in his tent. And over on that hill, the Philistine army is sitting there, and they've got the swagger. They got the moves like Jagger, because they've got Goliath. And Goliath is sitting here going, "Look at me. Bring your man out. Let's battle it. I win. We're your slaves. You win. Or I'm sorry, I win. You're my slaves. You win. We're your slaves." By the way, did he even think that his losing was a possibility?
No.
No, he's 9.5 foot tall. Did you see how when I read here, everything about him was bronze
huge.
and huge, except for one thing. What? What was that? The spearhead on his spear was iron. Remember how I said we're transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age? Saul had the technological advantage. What happened in the Bronze Age? If you and I duked it out with Bronze Age weapons, we could sort of do some damage to each other, but bronze does not really hold up well to strikes.
Brittle.
It's
No, it bends.
yeah, no, it bends.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's better than copper.
It tends to bend. It's copper. Have you ever fought with copper wire? It's very soft and malleable. Now, bronze is stronger than copper, but it's still a main component in there is copper. And so you have the equivalent of Goliath bringing a gun to a knife fight. So the Israelites, remember, they're the backwater people. They probably have, for the most part here, just bronze instruments. Goliath himself isn't any better. He's got mostly bronze, except he's got that iron spearhead. It's 15 pounds. Now what happens when iron and bronze come together?
Iron beats.
Yeah, in a game of rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Iron beats bronze very badly. So not only is Goliath a 9-foot-tall combatant in the prime of his life, strong warrior, his armor alone weighing 125 pounds, not only is he a big bad dude, he's got the technology. He's got the iron spearhead on top of everything else. This isn't even close to a fair fight. Can I say to you, my friends, this is the way of the world? My whole life, the people in my life have come to me with deals. Hey, have I got a deal for you? And by and large, the deals are always rigged in the other person's favor. The other person always gets to set the terms. And so here Goliath has set the term. Hey, just grab your champion and we'll fight. What's he pretending? He's pretending like it's somehow a fair fight. He knows it's not. He's not dumb. But he's out there and he's crowing like it is when he knows that it isn't. And this is how the world will come to you. Hey, come on. Play with our system. Play by our rules. But guess what? The rules are rigged. The rules are always in the other person's favor. And so the people of Israel are cowering in fright. And Saul, the people's champion, the people's king, who should be out there on that other hill answering this challenge? That's for Saul. That's in his job description. That's his duty. Guess what? He's back in his tent. And he ain't coming out. So you see the morale. The Philistines are on this other hill, and they're pretty sure they've got this. The Israelites are on their hill, and they're pretty sure they ain't got this. And that's the situation. Now, let's continue reading in verse 12. David's father Jesse was an old man who belonged to the Ephraim clan and lived in Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons: Eliab, Abinadab, Shammah. The 3 of them had gone off to fight in Saul's army. David was Jesse's youngest son. He took care of the father's sheep. And he went back and forth between Bethlehem and Saul's camp. Goliath came out and gave his challenge every morning and every evening for 40 days. Do you get the sense of this here? This is a desperate situation for Israel. This big bad dude, 9 foot tall. Have you ever been in the room with an NBA guy? I've been in the room. Not with an NBA player, but with a semi-pro. And they were 6'8", 6'9". My stepfather, as a matter of fact, used to hang out with a professional wrestler from the 70s and the 80s called Big John Studd. Maybe you remember him. He was pretty old school. Big John Studd was 6'9", 6'10". And my stepfather is still in his 70s. 6'5", 6'6". Big dude. I've been around some big boys. And I want to tell you, this is bad news. So 40 days and 40 nights, this is a desperate situation. If you're God's people, this is a great time for God to send some help. So what does he do? Well, let's read on. Verse 17. One day Jesse told David, "Hurry and take this sack of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers at the army camp. And here are 10 large chunks of cheese to take to their commanding officer. Find out how your brothers are doing and bring back something that shows they're all right. They're with Saul's army fighting with the Philistines in Elah Valley." What do you have here? You got a picture of an old man. He's worried. Why is he worried? His sons are in grave danger. So David obeyed his father. He got up early the next morning and left someone else in charge of the sheep. Then he loaded the supplies and started off. He reached the army camp just as the soldiers were taking their places and shouting the battle cry. The army of Israel and the Philistine army stood there facing each other. David left his things with the men in charge of supplies and ran up to the battle line to ask his brothers if they were well. While David was talking with them, Goliath came out from the line of Philistines and started boasting as usual. David heard him. When the Israelite soldiers saw Goliath, they were scared and ran off. They said to each other, "Look how he keeps coming out to insult us. The king is offering a big reward to the man who kills Goliath. That man will even get to marry the king's daughter. And no one in his family will ever have to pay taxes again." Time out here. When the government says, "Hey, you won't have to pay taxes anymore," you know they're desperate. Verse 26. David asked some soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and stopping him from insulting our people? Who does that worthless Philistine think he is? He's making fun of the army of the living God." Do you see here that David is not like the other soldiers? The other soldiers are afraid. And David is sitting there going, he's only 9 foot tall. He's rude, he's ignorant, he's profane, he's insulting the army of the living God. Why doesn't someone go over and deal with him? Remember, he's a young boy at this time. So he doesn't understand everything, but at the same point in time, look at the different perspective he brings. He's fearless. And why is he fearless? This is going to matter. Then the soldiers told David what the king would give the man who killed Goliath. Now David's older brother, Eliab, heard him talking with the soldiers. Eliab was angry at him and said, "What are you doing here anyway? Who's taking care of the sheep back out in the desert, you spoiled brat? You came here just to watch the fighting, didn't you?" "Now what have I done?" David answered. "Can't I even ask a question? Doesn't this sound like brothers fighting?" Then he turned and asked another soldier the same thing he asked the others, and he got the same answer. Some soldiers overheard David talking, so they told Saul what David had said. Saul sent for David, and David came. "Your Majesty," David said, "this Philistine shouldn't turn us into cowards. I'll go out and fight him myself." Saul said, "You don't have a chance against him. You're only a boy. He's been a soldier all his life." But David told him, "Your Majesty, I take care of my father's sheep. And one of them is dragged off by a lion or a bear, I go after it and beat that wild animal until it lets the sheep go. If the wild animal turns and attacks me, I grab it by the throat and kill it. Sir, I've killed lions and bears that way, and I can kill this worthless Philistine. He shouldn't have made fun of the army of the living God. The Lord has rescued me from the claws of lions and bears, and he'll keep me safe from the hands of this Philistine." "Well, okay then." "All right," Saul answered. "Go ahead and fight him, and I hope the Lord will help you." Before we go further, have you noticed the pressure against believers and Christians in this culture? Have you noticed the accusations and insults? Have you noticed the war that's going on between people in this culture and Christians? This sounds pretty familiar, actually. You have a group of profane Philistines shouting insults at the people of God in this land, all over the nation. And you have Christians, you have cowardly Christians, hunkered down, standing on the hill, afraid to do anything. God send us Davids. So Saul had his own military clothes, and he put his armor on David, and he gave David a bronze helmet to wear. David strapped on a sword. He tried to walk around, but he was not used to wearing those things. "I can't move with all this stuff on," David said. "I'm just not used to it." David took off the armor and picked up his shepherd's stick. He went out to the stream and picked up 5 smooth rocks and put them in his leather bag. Then with his sling in his hand, he went straight toward Goliath. 5 rocks. By the way, why 5 rocks?
Goliath had 5 brothers.
Exactly. Anybody here been in fights as a kid? Do you know how that stuff goes down? If it's in a group setting and you challenge so-and-so, you never just fighting so-and-so. You're fighting his brother and his best friend and his best friend. So David's saying, 5 stones, that's all I need. 5 stones and the Lord. So he put them in his leather bag. Then with a sling in his hand, he went straight toward Goliath. So who's got the technology? Goliath. Who's got the old-fashioned? David. Goliath came toward David, walking behind the soldier who was carrying his shield. Goliath's shield was so big and heavy and armored that he had his own person to carry it. Hello? When Goliath saw that David was just a healthy, good-looking boy, he made fun of him. "Do you think I'm a dog?" Goliath asked. "Is that why you've come after me with a stick?" What's he saying? "We coming out to play a game of fetch, boy?" He cursed David in the name of the Philistine gods and shouted, "Come on, when I'm finished with you, I'll feed you to the birds and wild animals." Now listen to David's response. "You've come out to fight me with a sword and a spear and a dagger, but I've come out to fight you in the name of the Lord all-powerful. He is the God of Israel's army, and you have insulted him too. Today the Lord will help me defeat you. I'll knock you down and cut off your head, and I'll feed the bodies of other Philistine soldiers to the birds and wild animals. Then the whole world will know that Israel has a real God. Everybody here will see that the Lord doesn't need swords or spears to save his people. The Lord always wins his battles, and he will help us defeat you. David got a good talking game, doesn't he? But the battle belongs to the Lord.
That's right.
So Goliath started forward, and David ran toward him. He put a rock in his sling, swung the sling around by its straps. When he let go of one strap, the rock flew out and hit Goliath on the forehead. It cracked his skull, and he fell face down on the ground. David defeated Goliath with a sling and a rock. He killed him without even using a sword. David ran over and pulled out Goliath's sword. He used it to cut off Goliath's head. When the Philistines saw what had happened to their hero, they started running away. But the soldiers of Israel and Judah let out a battle cry and went after them as far as Gath and Ekron. In other words, they chased them back into their own cities. The bodies of the Philistines were scattered all along the road from Sha'arim to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites' army returned from chasing the Philistines, they took what they wanted from the enemy camp. David took Goliath's head to Jerusalem, but he kept Goliath's weapons in his own tent. I just want to share with my fellow Christians, profane forces have come against God's people in this land.